Meet the Knish. This humble hunk of dough contains multitudes. It's far more than its simple, unassuming dough filled with mashed potatoes, often strewn with onions. The Knish is in fact a catalyst for talking about memory, for mourning, and hopefully for getting to know your neighbor. So before we go on, I'd like to check the Knish temperature in the room. How many Knish veterans do we have? Impressive. Knish curious? Any Knish virgins in the house? Welcome to all of you. Hopefully that will change by the end. The Knish can come in many forms, and great debate, heated debates have been conducted over which form is the best. The square or fried version, often associated with the Brooklyn Boardwalk. The round or baked version is often stuffed with potatoes. It can also be filled with kasha or buckwheat groats. It can be filled with spinach or savory fillings like meat, as well as a sweet cheese with fruit. I'm not in a position to tell you which is best. You'll have to decide on your own. The Knish, above all, is a catalyst for memory, and it's really a vehicle for nostalgia. It's hard to talk about New York history without talking about the Knish. In fact, while the Jewish population began in New York in 1654, the Knish really came on the scene probably in the early 1900s. You may recognize Yonah Schimmel's Knishery, and you'll have a chance to get to know it in a more intimate way in just a moment. This is still standing on Houston Street, and it opened as a shop in 1910. So just over 100 years ago. Before that, it was a push cart. If you go there, it still has a working dumbwaiter. There's now a jalapeno cheddar Knish, which probably wasn't around when our grandparents were on the scene. But Yonah Schimmel's was started by a rabbi. Apparently his wife came up with the recipe. And according to folklorist Nathan Ausubel, who wrote in the 1940s, the Knish, in fact, sprang fully formed from the minds of the Jewish people. My research has indicated it may have its roots in Ukraine or Poland, but I like Ausubel's description. Now, the climate in the Lower East Side in the early 1900s was one of really packed with Jewish immigrants. Yiddish was everywhere on the streets, and that probably gave way to the Knish Wars of Rivington Street. The New York Times reported on it in 1916. No blood, no gunshots, no Knishes were thrown, but there was a price war. And the Knish, which was being sold for 5 cents, went down to 3. And when the Austrian-born owner of one Knish shop, Max Green, heard this, he hired a German band to lure customers to his store. His opponent or rival, Mr. London, across the way, then put up placards and signs and offered discounts. The article left us looking for future development, so I can't tell you how that ended up. But I can tell you it's hard to get a Knish for 5 cents this day. Probably more in the $3 range. Uptown at the Pastrami Queen, closer to $10. I have a personal connection to the Knish. I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in northern Queens. And my family would make frequent pilgrimages the length of Long Island, or rather, the width. No, the length, long top to bottom. We would go the length of Long Island, about an hour, in a pilgrimage to get Mrs. Stahl's Knishes, the food of my father and of his father before him. This is in Brighton Beach, and right about a block from the ocean, from the Atlantic Ocean. And Mrs. Stahl's had great Knishes and a very particular aroma, but it was also like our synagogue. We were secular Jews, and walking into Mrs. Stahl's meant we were going to a place where people understood us. We wouldn't have to explain or translate any Yiddish phrases, or we knew what a pretzel was, which was a flat piece of over-fried dough, which was delicious, but we didn't have to ask. It was home. As the population changed, Mrs. Stahl's changed. It was largely a big influx of Russian immigrants, and the store had to take on a roommate, and it shared space with a shish kebab entity, and so that meant the Lime Ricky counter was no longer a distinct entity, and the counter that had something completely different. But still, Mrs. Stahl's was there. We could visit. My grandmother was fortunate at the end of her life to move into senior housing right nearby. So again, my identity was fused with Mrs. Stahl's. My grandmother always had several Knishes in her freezer. Kasha was her favorite, which means buckwheat groats. So when my grandmother passed away, I continued my trips to Mrs. Stahl's as a way to pay homage to her and to evoke her presence. It was better than going to the cemetery. Mrs. Stahl's was real. Even though Mrs. Stahl no longer worked there, but it was still the presence. This store was located in the south of Brooklyn, underneath the elevated subway. And then in 2005, it became a subway. This was a traumatic discovery for me, and I sprang into action, and in the name of my people, had to find out what happened. It turned out the recipe was adopted or purchased by an Italian pasta maker in southern New Jersey. Mike Conti made his kitchen kosher in preparation for the Knish. He made this humble hunk of dough alongside his gnocchi and his ravioli. And he made the dough by machine, but he finished it by hand. And he would ship it by truck back up to New York City, where it's sold at places like Murray's Bagels in the Chelsea section of New York. So the recipe was still alive, but Mrs. Stahl's was sort of AWOL. And I felt confused by the fact that Knishes were now being produced by people of another culture. Who would maintain this legacy? It's a big cultural question for me, and I felt sort of exiled. At the same time, another Brooklyn Knish maker, Gabilla's, who makes the square kind, went into self-imposed exile because it left Williamsburg for Copiague, Long Island, because, as the owner told me, the price of the factory was worth more than the Knish business. So there were no Knishes being made in Brooklyn on a large scale. But Brooklyn was still the repository of the memory of the Knish. This is Ruby, the Knish man, who sold his wares from a cart outside of elementary schools in Canarsie, Brooklyn. Today, entire websites are devoted to Ruby. And I am interested in memory and roots. This is my family's trip to Białystok, Poland, where I thought we were from. I thought my maternal grandmother's name was Eva Levy at birth. It turns out it was Riva Chapnik. Go figure. This is her birth certificate that I found. It also turns out she was born not in Białystok, but in Knishin, where I went. Knishin. Yes, I took it as a sign from on high. This is the town square of Knishin. Skolna Street harkens back to a Jewish population and a Jewish school. Not a lot of signs of Jewishness there today, no remnant of my family, but I did meet some people. This is my translator and the town historian who remembered a legend of the Knish. That made me happy. He said that in olden times, during funerals, women paid to accompany people. Professional weepers would distribute a round covered pastry, the knisha, the Knish. And it fit in well with the local history because Knishin is the home to one of the few extant Jewish cemeteries. Now it looks like a forest. It was saved from complete destruction because it was built on the edge of royal pools. So you can imagine there's little embankments, kind of hard to raise. Some of the gravestones date to the 1700s. They're largely in Hebrew, now maintained by young people in the town of Knishin with the help of Israeli counterparts who visit every so often. The Knish embodies a lot of things, and they don't all have to be tragic. In New York, 2nd Avenue between 14th Street and Houston was known as Knish Alley. I commemorated this last fall with a dozen eager Knish enthusiasts in the Knish Alley revival. We visited a theater and other Yiddish landmarks on the Strip. And the Knish tradition is alive in St. Paul, Minnesota, where women come together every Wednesday to bake Knishes at a senior home to benefit residents. Here they are, led by Hazel Chase in her 80s, about a dozen women, the Knish Ladies of the Shalom Home in St. Paul. You don't have to be Jewish to make a Knish. Here are some artists at the Banff Center for the Arts in an all-night Knish baking session, which really brought together people who had never heard of the Knish, maybe never met a Jewish person. I look forward to sharing Knishes with you, and I hope it will be a catalyst for our coming together. Thank you.